Good afternoon, everyone. My name is António Pereira Neves. I am a journalist with the Portuguese news agency, Lusa. I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of Clube Lisboa, who is bringing us together to discuss the oceans that belong to all of us. I want to remind everyone that this session and all other sessions have simultaneous translation. Whether you're watching on Zoom or YouTube, you can pose questions and we will select a few to keep our debate lively. Today, we are looking north to the Arctic, where an environmental catastrophe, the melting of the ice, is also making a new sea route. I would like to introduce the panelists for today. We have with us Rear Admiral Carlos Ventura Soares of the Portuguese Navy. He's the Director General of the Portuguese Hydrographic Institute and specializes in hydrography and oceanography. We also have Jorge D'Almeida, who is the CEO of SACONSULT. He's also a university professor and has more than 40 years of experience in the shipping sector. We also have Kristina Gjerde. She's the senior consultant for the high seas of the Global Polar Marine Program of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And we also have Karen Sack. She's the CEO of Ocean Unite, with more than 20 years of experience working in non-governmental organizations regarding environmental questions. I will start this debate by going to Rear Admiral Ventura Soares. I would like you to tell us what is happening in the Arctic. How is this part of the world changing?
Well, thank you, Antonio. First of all, I'd like to greet the members of the panel and also the audience. And I would also like to thank the Clube of Lisboa for the invitation to participate in this conference. Well, just to help me with my presentation, I have some slides that I'm going to introduce right now. I think everybody is seeing the slides, I think. Mm-hmm. Well, the first slide is starting by the definition of the Arctic region. Well, it depends of course of the criteria. Anyway, this slide shows a kind of environmental criteria to define the Arctic region. So it's basically the Arctic Ocean plus the coastal areas of North America and North Asia and North Europe. So it's basically the area that we are expecting for this Arctic region. So this second slide, I think, is an important one because it shows the Arctic Ocean bathymetry. Because this bathymetry is going to have influence how the states see the Arctic and the use of the Arctic. And we can see in this slide that with the red areas, they are the shallow waters. I mean, shallow means less than 100 meters depth. So it's relatively shallow. And with the purple and the blue is the deepest area of the Arctic Ocean. So the green is right in the middle. So we can see with this map that is the shallow water is basically in the Russian coast, while of course right in the middle of the Arctic Ocean is the deepest area. So I have a third slide with maps that represents the Arctic sea ice distribution in two antagonic points. The first one on the left-hand side is a picture obtained 1 year ago in March of 2020, where we can see that the distribution of the sea ice around the Arctic Sea last year was roughly the same of the average for the average of the 30 years from 1981 to 2010. And on the contrary, on our right hand side, we can see that in the last September, 6 months ago, we had a coverage of the sea ice that is, I can say, 2/3 of the average of 30 years average, which means that there's a real impact in summer situation relatively of the sea ice distribution. This kind of effects will have, of course, consequences in the way how the states approach to the Arctic issues. Well, now I'd like to, with this scheme, I'd like to address the challenges for the Arctic. And well, first of all, the globalization. Globalization needs, of course, natural resources and maritime routes for trading. I mean, which means shipping, in this case, in the Arctic Ocean. We could say that at the same time that globalization processes speed up the climate changes. As a matter of fact, in the Arctic, climate changes means temperature increases and, of course, sea ice melting. If we have ice melting, of course, we are going to improve the technical accessibility to natural resources in the bottom, in the sea bottom, in the seabed and subseabed of the Arctic Ocean, because it's much more easy to operate in the seabed if we don't have too much ice on the ocean. Of course, for navigation purposes, and of course for safety navigation, is much better to have less ice because of the safety of the ships, and we can think that the new maritime routes will be a very obvious solution for trading, and to use the Arctic as a route for trading, namely between Asia and Europe and North America. So they are basically these environmental and economic challenges for the Arctic, but of course we have to think also about the political challenges on that. I'm talking about governance, of course. How the Arctic states and the other ones deal with this? Well, it is important to have a governance model, and this political challenge that I'm going to pass to analyze the next slide, and I have only one more slide to show in this presentation. So the political challenge on that is addressed or has been addressed in the last years through the Arctic 5, which means the littoral coastal states of the Arctic, Russia, United States, Canada, Norway, and Denmark. But starting in the 90s, Arctic Council was founded in, I think it's 1996, where plus to the coastal states, also Finland, Sweden and Iceland participate in this Arctic Council. It's a kind of consultation forum where the states can, in a smooth, I think, way, try to deal with the problems of the Arctic, and is a kind of governance that is not following exactly the law, because of course they have to use the law of the sea in case of the Arctic Ocean, but is not their decisions in the Arctic Council. They didn't follow the law, international law but it's much more forum to exchange and to prepare ideas and solutions in a very practical way. In the recent years, there was some other some other states that adhere to this Arctic Council. Actually, there are 13 countries plus some NGOs that participate in this forum. That is still very important to the states interested in the Arctic deal with all these issues. Of course, we are not thinking about a global commons as Antarctica in this case, because Antarctica is ruled by Antarctic Treaty. That is a law, is international law. Well, of course, this political challenge could be a good solution to address the environmental challenge. Well, I think to protect and to preserve ecosystems based in scientific research, it's an issue that could be very comfortable for all the states, because there is no country that think that is a different way about this kind of issues. When do we address economic challenges? Things are a little bit different. Of course, everyone is adhere about sustainable development, but the real thing we have to think about energetic and mineral resources, namely in the seabed and subseabed of the Arctic Ocean. And in this case, we are starting to have some questions, namely some conflicts about the maritime boundaries, EEZs, for instance, and with the recent process of the continental shelf extension claims by the states, as what Larry Meyer referred in the previous panel, we are starting to have the conflicts because there is an issue that is not solved, and I think that we need some more decades to define clearly what will be the boundaries, namely related with the continental shelf extension. Finally, about the Northeast Passage and the Northwest Passage, there are two main problems related with this. The first one is the navigational safety. Of course, to assure the safety of the navigation, we need icebreakers, a search and rescue service, maritime pilotage. We need to prevent oil spill dangers, and of course we need to have some shelters, some harbors to protect the ships in case of adverse meteo conditions. In addition to that, we are having here questions related with the UNCLOS, the law of the sea, because there is some tricky questions about innocent passage and transit passage that should be addressed, because we have to think about there are some coastal states with sovereignty and jurisdiction, and there is some issues that should be solved until we have a free Northeast Passage or Northwest Passage in the future. So this is my first address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now go to Jorge. Thank you for joining us. Now we have heard Rear Admiral Ventura Soares describe what is an ecological catastrophe, but this is also the opening of a new sea route. What opportunities will this bring, and how will the shipping sector launch itself on this?
Thank you, Antonio. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all. Let me start by thanking the Clube de Lisboa, and particularly Professor Fernando Cardoso, for the invitation to participate in this panel. I think a good way to phrase in a colloquial way your point is to ask the Arctic climate catastrophe, does it have a silver lining for shipping? That's what we're talking about. And the short answer is yes, but with many caveats, still many question marks, as we'll see later. But I must say, I find it a bit ironic that we're talking about global warming, basically the effect of global warming, at the same time that we're watching on TV all these images from the Texas snowstorm and what's incredibly happening in there. And I presume it is all related. And in fact, I noticed that there's a new slang that is becoming popular. Instead of talking about global warming, people talking about global weirding. In other words, there's something weird about the climate. It's not only the Arctic, it's everywhere. And nobody really knows in which direction it is going. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the sea lines and so on, I thought it would be useful to frame the discussion with a bit of history, because there's a lot of history that goes back to the 16th century for the attempts to find a seaway passage through the Arctic. And in fact, the first attempts were attempts to try to find an alternative to the Portuguese sea route to India. And this was a very important expedition that was sponsored by the King of England, Henry VII, around 1497. That sent an explorer called John Cabot, which was the English name. The guy actually was an Italian sailor. And he sent him with 5 ships and 200 men to find the sea passage at the time on the Canadian side, the Northwest Passage, so-called. They never returned, so they were never found. And then after that, there were many unsuccessful attempts to try to find a seaway passage. And the most, maybe the better known one, for the wrong reasons, was an expedition in 1845, so the 19th century, by Captain John Franklin, so-called Franklin Expedition, which was extremely well equipped with 2 ships, 129 men. One of the ships had a foretell name of Terror, was the name of the ship. They all perished. And only recently, in 2014, a Canadian research team found the remnants, the shipwrecks of these ships near King William Island. And that tells you how difficult it is, in fact, to go through this process and to find the seaway. Some of the bodies, the bodies of the 129 men were found in several places along the time. And there were clear signs of cannibalism and other atrocities. And they have been the subject of several movies, including some that you can see in YouTube, that shows what an horrendous adventure it was. And by the way, let me add just a little trivia that I also learned. I didn't know about it. I hear in the news sometimes the name for the president of the United States, the desk in the Oval Office, as being the Resolute desk, the Resolute desk. Well, it's called the Resolute because it was built with wood that was recovered from a ship called Resolute that went after to try to find Franklin 10 years later, and also a shipwreck. This one, they were able to recover it, and Queen Victoria very gracefully decided to offer to the American president a desk that weighs about 500 tons. I'm sorry, 500 kilos, half a ton. Actually, the first time that there was a sea crossing of the Northwest Passage was in 1906, so many years later, by a name that we all know probably for other reasons, which is Roald Amundsen, before he became famous with the South Pole expedition. He was the first one to complete the crossing of the Northwest Passage entirely by ship, a very small ship called Gioia, with 45 net resistance. But it took him 3 years to cross the Northwest Passage. And only 6 years later, in 1969, there was a commercial ship that actually did the crossing of the Northwest Passage, a tanker, a US tanker called Manhattan. And the intention was to find if there was a way of carrying oil without having to build a pipeline, but clearly it did not work out because the Alaskan pipeline was built. So all these attempts shows you how difficult it has been, what interest exists from many centuries ago, how difficult it is. Nowadays, the Northwest Passage is rarely utilized. The passage that is commercially useful right now is the Northern Sea Passage. But maybe I should stop here and talk about it a little further on, okay?
Thank you, Jorge. I will now go to Kristina. Kristina, Gjerde, thank you for joining us today. Now let's look beyond the Arctic, and I would like to ask you to tell us what are the impacts of the Arctic Ocean in general and for marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the Lisbon Club for hosting this conversation with such an interesting panel. And to the fellow panelists, I'd like to sort of say, there are three effects of the melting Arctic that I think we need to be aware of today and then go into details later. One is, of course, the climate effects. That's where the melting fresh water from the Arctic is truly disrupting global climate patterns. We're seeing it reflected in what's happening in Texas right now. We're seeing it what's happening in the warming Georges Bank. My neighbor, I live in Massachusetts, where it's also one of the hottest bodies of water on this planet. So as the ice sheets in the Arctic melt, as the ice sheets in the Greenland glaciers melt, we are fundamentally changing the physical, chemical, and biological nature of our planet. At the same time, we're creating I think it's very apt to recall what Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said, is that we are basically making war on the planet. Our continuing emissions of carbon dioxide, as well as black carbon in the Arctic, are actually creating a threefold crisis. He says, for too long, we have been waging a senseless and suicidal war on nature. The result is three interlinked environmental crises: climate disruption, biodiversity loss, and pollution that threaten our viability as a species. And this calls in many ways for a global perspective. So this is the political effects that I would like to focus on now and later. Is Antonio Guterres has also said that the challenges ahead clearly demand a more inclusive and more networked multilateralism. He's calling for a new global deal among countries to ensure that power, benefits, and opportunities are shared more broadly and fairly. And these apply to the Arctic as well. They also apply to what's going on at the United Nations for developing a new treaty for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And the importance of this new treaty is it provides a global perspective to regional efforts to develop, sustain, and protect the environment, the marine environment. In the Arctic, for so long, we've thought of it as largely a coastal state enclave. That's a regional sea. But as we're seeing the Arctic melt, it's revealing a vast body of high seas, the Central Arctic Ocean, that in many ways, as we say, belongs to all of us. And so our concerns about its health, its welfare, and what it's doing to the rest of the planet need to become center to our attention. This also calls for policy effects, the effects of the melting Arctic ice water. And this is the need for a more humble and precautionary approach to management. That's what we've seen the leadership in the Arctic nations and the fishing nations calling for a 16-year pause to fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. This is the type of attitude we need for all the activities in the Arctic as well as in the rest of the global ocean, because it's only through collaborative scientific information that we'll truly understand how to reduce the footprint of human activities to a level that is compatible with what the ecosystems need and can help us wage peace with the planet and not war with the planet. I'm mindful that the United States, we've just adopted a policy to make environmental protection and climate change top priorities. How can we bring the nations of the world to see that the interlinkages between climate change and environmental policy? The International Maritime Organization recently adopted a phase out of heavy fuel oil for the Arctic, but it left so many gaps, sorry about the screen here, so many gaps and loopholes in that phase out that states, as they are continuing to bring shipping into the Arctic, could in fact exacerbate the climate the climate crisis. So we really need to think holistically, globally, inclusively, and with a long-term perspective about what is going on. And I would just plea that things like environmental impact assessments from the Arctic 5, the coastal states, for what they are doing, how that's going to affect the Central Arctic Ocean, how it affects weather and climate patterns for the rest of the world, really need to be first and foremost in their minds as we merge into an open Arctic Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina. I will now address Karen. Thank you for joining us today. Now let's go to the other side of the Earth and look at the Antarctic. What can we learn and possibly hope for if we consider the way that the nations of the world have come to share the Antarctic?
Thank you, Antonio, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. It's so unusual for us to have a conversation that stretches from the Arctic to the Antarctic and everywhere in between. And we thought it might be fun to take a quick trip down to the Antarctic through a short video that's narrated by now Special Envoy for the Climate, John Kerry, to just show us a little bit about what's going on in the Antarctic. If we could play the video, please.
Encircling the icy continent of Antarctica is the most pristine of all marine habitats, the Great Southern Ocean. Looking down on this ocean, the sheer beauty and power of the natural world is overwhelming. This is our last ocean frontier. Over 9,000 species that can't be found anywhere else in the world call this place home. Even species that don't live here depend on it. Strong Antarctic currents carry deep-sea nutrients to faraway oceans, sustaining 3/4 of the world's marine life. As remote as it is, the Southern Ocean is under increasing pressure. It's one of the fastest warming places on Earth. And there is a growing interest in commercial fishing in this area. The strain is becoming visible. We have the power to protect this ocean. It can be done, and in fact, it's already begun. In 2016, 24 countries and the European Union made history by creating the largest marine protected area on the planet in the Ross Sea. These countries are members of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CCAMLR. Their visionary decision to protect the Ross Sea was praised around the globe. But CCAMLR also made an even more important promise, one that will have a bigger impact. They agreed to establish a network of large-scale marine protected areas throughout the Southern Ocean, including in the Weddell Sea, East Antarctica, and the Antarctic Peninsula. These protected areas would connect ecosystems, supporting marine animals that migrate between them as they forage and breed. And the benefits of these reserves will spread well beyond their boundaries. Our planet is changing, and never has this region been more fragile or important than it is today. Protecting the Ross Sea was only the beginning. It's time for CCAMLR to deliver on its word by working steadily toward a network of marine reserves that will safeguard the world's final ocean frontier before it's too late.
the Southern Ocean that surrounds Antarctica, just like the Arctic, Antarctica is being disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, with an increase of more than 5 degrees Celsius in average water surface temperature over the past 50 years. And the Antarctic circumpolar current that swirls around the continent is warming much more rapidly than the global ocean as a whole. The place that is experiencing the greatest effects of climate change in the Antarctic is the Antarctic Peninsula, the part that is just near the tip of South America, where the temperature, air temperature, has increased 3 degrees Celsius in the past 50 years. Just to give a comparison, reports show that Antarctica and Greenland are losing ice 6 times faster than expected. And that if they continue along this worst case scenario, we'll see an extra 17 centimeters of sea level rise by the end of the century, putting 400 million people at risk from annual coastal flooding by 2100. So these issues in the Arctic and the Antarctic are really important in terms of what they mean for all of us living around the world. You know, the differences are also very clear. Unlike the international waters of the Arctic, the Antarctic has a robust governance system in place, actually dating back to the late 1950s and the height of the Cold War, where the Antarctic Treaty was put together and declared Antarctica a place of peace and science. And that was to ensure that nuclear weapons weren't placed on the continent. And that system, that Antarctic Treaty system, which is going to be celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, was then added to in the 1990s, the early 1990s, by the Madrid Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty, which is very focused on Antarctic protection, environmental protection, and really had its roots in a desire to extract minerals and do mining in the Antarctic, which has, because of this protocol, literally been put on ice. So the differences we see in the Antarctic is that we've seen multilateralism come together in a kind of geopolitical common interest to keep some things from happening in the Antarctic. So no mining and mineral extraction, no weapons in the Antarctic, the focus on science and science bringing the international community together. There have also been protections put in place by the International Maritime Organization. So you cannot use heavy fuel oil in the Antarctic because of the risk of harm. And there are some areas that are particularly protected and recognized as special areas for conservation. Where the Antarctic has been a little different from the Arctic has been in the area of fishing. So actually, Antarctica is exemplary, unfortunately, in terms of overfishing internationally. In fact, whaling in the Antarctic and overfishing, serial overfishing for different species has really had a negative effect on the environment. We have a body, a legal body in the Antarctic to bring countries together to make decisions, but those decisions are based on consensus. So everyone needs to agree. And as former Secretary Kerry was talking about establishing protected areas in the Antarctic, the biggest protected area in the world in international waters is in the Ross Sea in Antarctica, which is amazing, but it has taken years and years to get there because consensus decision-making means that you need every country on board. And if there are just a few countries that are not on board, you can actually stop a decision going forward. So all of the issues that Kristina was talking about with regard to the high seas, we can learn from the Antarctic to take some of those lessons to the high seas, to require prior environmental impact assessment, to establish protected areas. But we should also learn from them and take them to the Arctic. The Arctic is ahead of the Antarctic in setting up that moratorium on commercial fisheries in the high seas areas of the Arctic. until we know what exists and there is a legal regime in place. And we should learn that lesson for the rest of the global ocean as well. So a lot of back and forth on these various issues, multilateralism, geopolitics, and of course, the key difference that our early speakers are talking about is the economics. In the Antarctic, of course, there are not the economic drivers that there are in the Arctic, but that has helped with multilateralism, drive it forward. And again, we need to take those lessons and apply them to the Arctic and the rest of the high seas.
Thank you, Karen. We will get back right to the economic side of it. Just to remind everyone that is watching that you can pose your questions through Zoom and through YouTube. They will reach us, and we will make sure that our speakers get a chance to answer them. I would like to go back to Jorge now. Jorge, you've given us an historical framing of the Arctic. Now I would like to define how fragile an environment the Arctic is, and we've also seen how rich in resources it is. How is the shipping sector or the resources sector going about exploring it? Are they taking into consideration just how fragile it is?
Antonio, let me try to see if I can share here a slide. Can you see it? All right, this is a very sketchy image of the various crossings and on the polar shipping routes. As I mentioned earlier, the Northwest Passage is not really that much used because it's not predictable. The icing is not predictable, and it's basically an alternative to the Panama Canal. The more important sea route is what's called the Northern Sea Route or the Northeast Sea Route through the Russian waters, which is an alternative to the Suez Canal. Okay, and it was opened to commercial shipping only in 2011, not that long ago. Until then, basically during the Soviet period was kept very much as a private area for military needs and oil and gas drilling. And then, of course, now it's changing very quickly. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of navigation in the on the North Sea route, since 2011, where the transit was basically zero, until 2019, which is the latest numbers I have, the sea traffic increased to 18 million tons. However, out of those 18 million tons, only 5% is transit. In other words, ships that go from all the way across from the Strait of Bering to the Atlantic. All the rest is actually cargo that stays in local ports, Murmansk being the main one. So for the time being, the transit traffic, the transit cargo is very, very small. And the reason for it is that, thank God, the conditions are still too difficult to be able to do it on a regular basis. The first time that a shipping company, container shipping company, which is the biggest mammoth, I would say, tried to cross the northern sea route was in 2018. Maersk, the Danish company, was the largest shipping company in the world. They did a trial passage with a ship called Ventura Maersk with icebreakers and so on. They were able to complete the passage, but they felt that it was not commercially viable yet. Okay. In the meantime, the Chinese shipping company COSCO, which is the third largest container company in the world, decided to bet very heavily on this sea route. So they have declared openly, and they are starting to increase the number of sea crossings on the Northern Sea Passage. But we're still talking a very, very small number of crossings for the reasons I mentioned, that it's not predictable. When you're talking about container ships, the reliability of the schedule is very, very important on one side. On the other side, there's a scale effect. In other words, the bigger the ship, the less expensive it is to carry a container. And today's motherships have capacities above 16,000 TEUs, or containers of 20 footers. The bigger ones have 24,000. And the biggest ship that can cross the Northeast Passage, or the Northern Passage, was this Maersk ship is 3,000 TEU, so it's much smaller. And in a rule of thumb, if you double the size of a ship, you reduce the transportation cost by 30%. So the commercial attractiveness it's not there yet. It's still very much on a tentative scale. But COSCO is trying because, number one, they can afford it. Number two, they can see that for some merchandise, the fact that you are saving maybe 15 days in transit time can make up for the fact that it is in fact more expensive. You have very high value goods, then it makes sense to bring it through these routes because you save enough time. They are doing the same thing, as you know, with the rail connecting China to center of Europe, in fact all the way to Madrid, and hopefully soon to Sines by rail, because it saves around 15 days or so if it came all the way to Sines. And even though it's quite a bit more expensive than bringing by ship, there might be some goods for which there's a commercial advantage. We're talking still on fringes, very small amount of cargo. Now, the interesting notes that I think it's worthwhile mentioning, it goes more directly to your question, Antonio, is that all the other large shipping companies, COSCO, as I mentioned, they continue saying that they are betting on the future of the Northern Sea route for certain types of cargo. But all the other major ones, including Maersk, MSC, which is the second largest shipping company in the world, and the number 4, which is the French company CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, which is number 5, the Dutch company, they all have stated openly that they will not use the Arctic as an alternative sea route. I don't know if it's just temporarily. I don't know if it is because it's not commercial viable, but it's nice. It's a nice political stance to have. For the time being, they're all saying that. Maersk, after they did their trial, they were worried about the competition on COSCO, and they announced they would start a regular crossing in 2019, and basically they didn't do it. They're sitting on the fence. Now, on the positive news, I don't want to go too far, but on the positive news, what is happening is that there is a general conscience in the shipping industry that something needs to be done about climate. It's not just something nice to talk about, and there are some very specific initiatives that you may have heard of because they are mentioned in the papers and so on, but it's worthwhile just mentioning it here so that everybody's aware of it. The first one is the so-called Poseidon Principles. Poseidon Principles is an initiative by the banks, the largest lending banks of the shipping industry. Nowadays, there are 22 banks that control something like 80% of all the loans for shipping. They have decided that we're going to use the climate performance of the vessels as a criteria to lend money to new ships, for ship owners to buy new ships or ships in secondhand. And that is the intention of making it viable to meet the IMO climate goal of reducing 50% the emissions, the greenhouse gas by 2050 compared to 2008. So that's a very important initiative because the banks, and when the banks put their money on their mouths, usually that's a very good sign. But right alongside that, there is an initiative called Getting to Zero Coalition. It's an alliance of 120 companies, worldwide companies, mostly shipping companies, so mostly the polluters in quotes, that have committed to develop ships with zero emission that technically emit zero gas by 2030. So that's not far away. By 2030, to actually have ships that have zero emissions. The ship typically lasts 20 years, the economic lifetime. So that means by 2050, in thesis, every ship operating in the world, if this went ahead, will be emission-free. And that's a major initiative. They are spending a lot of money basically in research and technical development. We hope they'll be successful. And then there's also an initiative on the cargo side, the guys who put the cargo on the ships, the so-called shippers, right? They also form an alliance called Clean Cargo. And they have a large number of shippers that control 85% of all the cargo that is transported by containers, in which they're going to start using the performance, the climate performance of the ship, of the carriers, of the ships, as a criteria to decide which ships they're going to use to transport their cargo. So there's real initiatives with concrete objectives, and we'll see the impact very shortly. And I think this is good news for all of us.
Thank you, Jorge. Now, I would like to go back to Rear Admiral Ventura Soares. Now, we are looking at a region which is rich in resources, and where a container ship may pass, a warship may also pass, or a submarine may also pass. Are we looking at a potential new battleground? What can be done to contain the hunger of great powers like Russia or China over this new sea route?
Thank you, Antonio, for the question. Well, I think we have to think about this issue in a long-term perspective. I'm talking about the second half of this century. Of course, all the analysis will depend of the global warming trends and what is really the world concerning this issue in 2050. But anyway, I think there are two main kind of implications. Well, the first one is the freedom of navigation in all this area. Of course, in Antarctica there is no problem like this, because there is no jurisdiction of coastal states, but it's not the case over the Arctic, and the Arctic 5 are really convinced that they should control in their jurisdictional waters, and control in terms of how the navigation will be done in the Arctic Sea. Of course, Canada and Russia are the main coastal states on this. But there's problems like, for instance, Canada considers that the Northeast Passage is within the internal waters of Canada. So it's enough to stop any navigation if Canada doesn't know this kind of route in that waters. The Russians can do the same. I'm talking theoretically, not for real active foreign policy of that countries. But Russia can, I don't know, maybe even if the Northeast Passage is not in internal waters, but could be in the territorial waters or in some straits. So in fact, Russia can control that passage using strictly the international law of the sea, the UNCLOS. Mm-hmm. So they can do in this way. I think it's difficult now to forecast what will be the behaviors of that coastal countries. But as Jorge referred previously, the new routes for the Arctic, they are not a problem of today, but could be a problem in 30 or 40 years. Concerning the natural resources, I have no doubt that as far as there are some technical conditions to look at the seabed or the subseabed of the Arctic, there are some countries that are really interested on that, because the continents are starting to be sparse in terms of minerals. For instance, if you talk about the rare earth minerals, there is a kind of mineral that is all the technological powers in the world wants to have this kind of resources. So Arctic could be one of that sources, and I think with all these processes of the continental shelf extension claims, the countries, the coastal states could be use that extension to identify potential mineral extraction on the Arctic. So there are basically these two questions that I'd like to refer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to go back to Kristina. I will take a question that was sent to us from our audience about the condition of the Arctic seabed in terms of pollution and the direct impact on local species. What are we looking at right now, and what risks do these new sea lanes pose?
Well, I do have to confess, I'm a lawyer by training, not a scientist. I focus on areas beyond national jurisdiction, not the Arctic or the Antarctic. But applying what I know already, that was where you had shipping through the Northeast Atlantic. These ship lanes became some of the most heavily polluted passages. That was the bivalves would be soaking up the anti-fouling paints that the ships were applying to keep creatures from growing on them. Because the Arctic high seas has not yet been open to shipping, there would fortunately be very little, but what the Arctic high seas and the Arctic is getting are the long-range transports of pollution particles. And so the Arctic seafloor, just as they found in the Antarctic, there's actually life down way below the ice where they did not expect it. You can also expect that the pollutants from the rest of the planet are trickling down, but just not in the quantities yet until shipping would begin. But shipping is a huge problem, and with it goes noise. And as we've heard, that warming waters actually exacerbate the penetration of the noise. So it would make the impacts on the marine mammals and fish much worse. Climate change, warmer waters decrease the amount of oxygen that is available for the species to survive. At least the bluefin tuna and the swordfish require a certain level of oxygen in their water in order to live normal lives. This is the same for our belugas and our other Arctic features. The stratification of the water that we're getting in the Arctic is also going to be a serious problem. So I would just say we need to be looking at the problems of pollution that needs to be factored in any activities that go. And I think, as we've learned with oil and gas, is that the pollutants, once they are there, are very, very difficult to eradicate. And it's the reason why many countries are going very slow in developing their oil and gas resources in the Arctic. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristina. Karen, I'd like to ask you another question that has come to us from our audience. What is the strategic positioning that is taking place regarding the opportunities that we are looking at in the South Atlantic?
So, look, I think a couple of things that kind of mesh into that question. The first is that I think none of us should underestimate the very serious impacts that are currently taking place across the entire ocean as a result of climate change, the climate emergency, and the biodiversity crisis. And in fact, I think most scientists, certainly the International Panel on Climate Change that has advised the UN, are absolutely clear that we have less than 10 years to address these issues. And so in whatever we're talking about now, as we talk about the opening up of shipping, access to shipping or fishing or other extractions, whether it's the Arctic, the high seas, or the Antarctic, we need to really think twice about this. There should be big red flashing lights in front of any decision maker at the moment about enabling greater extraction from any of these areas because of the potential damage it could have on the rest of the planet, on the carbon cycle, on biodiversity, and on all of us. And so we really need to take a very precautionary approach to these issues. And that applies in the South Atlantic as well. I'm not sure if the person was referring to some of the issues of overfishing in the South Atlantic, particularly in high seas areas, or where countries' exclusive economic zones cross. I think the bottom line is that we have this amazing international treaty, the UN Law of the Sea Convention, which is a constitution for the ocean, and it gives countries certain rights and responsibilities. I think many countries have focused on those rights and what those rights give them in terms of access for exploitation, rather than focus on the responsibilities that come with those rights. And we really now need to focus on those responsibilities, which is why, as the UN negotiates a new high seas biodiversity treaty, the first global treaty that will focus on keeping life in the ocean rather than taking it out, we need to make sure that that treaty is robust, that it is in place as quickly as possible, that it requires prior environmental impact assessment before allowing activities to take place, that it has a strong dispute settlement process, and that it is based on science. And the same principles need to apply in the Arctic and the Antarctic. You know, we hold up the Antarctic as this beacon of multilateral decision-making for the rest of the world. But really, if you look over the last 10 years or so, because of the consensus decision-making requirements there, decisions to protect large areas of the Antarctic have been blocked by 2 countries, whereas the rest of the countries that are parties to that international treaty are ready to move forward. We need to make sure that as we move forward on international law in the Arctic, where there is no binding legal regime, and in the rest of the high seas, where this legal regime is under discussion, that we can't have a few countries holding the rest of the world hostage for progressive decision-making, particularly now at a time where we absolutely have to take that precautionary management. And I think the points that Professor Almeida was making about the importance of the business sector here are just key to stress as a final point. The finance sector, the folks that are financing those vessels, the insurers who are insuring the vessels that are going to the north or the south, or looking to engage in deep seabed mining and other factors, need to think very carefully about how their financing is enabling a path towards 3, 4, 4.5 degrees of warming, rather than sticking to the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 or below. Those are the things that really need to drive us at the moment. That's what global ocean governance needs to focus on.
Thank you again, Karen. Now I have another pressing question from our audience. I would like to address this question to Rear Admiral Ventura Soares. Will the melting of the Arctic submerge countries or parts of countries, for example, the Netherlands, and will it shift marine currents and the climate in the North Atlantic?
Well, thank you for the question. Well, actually, well, it depends of the models, and it depends how the scientific people treat the data. And I think it's one of the key points to approach all these questions and to have a general acceptance of the danger of the climate change is the lack of data that we really have on the oceans, especially in the Arctic and Antarctic, but all over the world. So we have a lack of information, and that can consider the precautional approach the right one for this problem of the climate changes. and it's the responsibility of the science to invest in observation. I think the United Nations Decade of the Ocean Science for Sustainable Development that starts this year, it will be a key point in order to have a global system of observations that can support the right interpretation and the right models for the future. I think in this case, of course, we know that the rising of the mean sea level, it's a reality all over the world, but it's not a reality in all the places. Even in Portugal, there is not enough data to make a statement, a definitive statement about this. And but of course, I think the main problem with this rising of the mean sea level probably will not be a problem for the Netherlands, but could be a problem for the islands in the Pacific Ocean, because of even for the protection of the inhabitants there is not the same thing. So I think the bottom line of my intervention is we humankind, we should invest in observation. We should understand better and better the ocean, because only in this way we can make influence in the decision makers that can be sustainable and absorbed by everybody. I think is the key point in this approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Kristina, I have another question for you that is a good question that just came from our audience. Do you find it likely or even possible that due to the environmental reasons, this should take place even before it becomes commercially appealing?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear it.
Is it likely, or is it even possible that due to all these environmental reasons, shipping through the Arctic might be forbidden? Nations might agree that it should be forbidden even before it becomes commercially appealing.
Well, okay, interesting question. First, I'd like to go back to sort of the impacts of the melting Arctic, if I may. I happen to have been looking back through the IPCC report on the special report on ocean and cryosphere in a changing ocean from 2019. And it lays out a pretty grim picture of the impacts of climate change on the ocean. And let me just quote this: over the 21st century, the ocean is projected to transition to unprecedented, why is this coming through, change, with increased temperatures, virtually certain, greater upper ocean stratification, very likely, further acidification, virtually certain, oxygen decline, medium confidence, and altered net primary productivity. This is the fundamental base of our food chain. So, we already know enough that this is going to dramatically alter food web supplies, climate regimes, weather patterns around the globe. The melting of the Arctic sea ice will not necessarily impact sea level rise in the Netherlands, but it will affect the rapidity of the melting of the Arctic glaciers, which will have a very serious effect on sea level rise everywhere. And so we are all interconnected and intertwined. And if we don't take action now, as well as commission lots and lots of scientific research to better understand the intricate balances between these various activities, we will be in very hot water. So with respect to shipping in the Arctic, shipping across the high seas, if you build on the model of we don't understand what the impact will be, what fuel will they be using? Will heavy fuel oil actually exacerbate climate change and the rapidity of the melting of the Arctic ice? The black soot that is exuded from the heavy fuel oil that is the predominant fuel these days, is actually making things far worse. So yes, it would be like, well, they call it the death of 1,000 knives, 1,000 nicks. This would be deliberately imposing many additional harms on our ocean by introducing uncontrolled shipping into the Arctic high seas. If you can put regulations to ensure it's decarbonized, clean fuels, that there's no impact on the stability of the ice as you go through, how much energy do the tankers and the icebreakers require? Sorry about the noise. So you need a full life cycle analysis of what the impacts of shipping would be. And yes, I would agree, as with fishing, you would want that done before we even start to consider any sea routes through the Arctic high seas. And then I would certainly spend time pleading with Russia to truly consider their power as a global coastal state in the Arctic to either accelerate global warming and the melting of the Arctic, or to slow it down by cleaning up shipping through their own waters. And that will require some significant political pressure. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristina. I would like to go back to Jorge and ask you, can the industry and can the shipping sector afford to miss this opportunity of shipping, of sailing, of sending ships through the Arctic? How essential is this to move the global economy along? Jorge, we can't hear you. Please activate your mic. Sorry, Jorge, we still can't hear you. Your mic is turned off.
Is it on now?
Thank you.
Is it on?
It is, thank you.
Okay. But basically what we're talking about, this trans-Arctic routes, there are two alternatives to two existing routes. The one through the Panama Canal and one through the Suez Canal, okay? By far the one that has more traffic, where the gains could be higher in commercial terms, is the one through the Suez Canal, which is the closest route between Asia and North Europe, where the shipping companies deploy their largest ships. The Panama Canal has a much lesser utilization for a couple of reasons. One is that the largest ships that exist in the world can't transit the Panama Canal anymore. It's too small. And number two, there is a very efficient alternative by discharging the big vessels in Los Angeles and Long Beach, and then distributing by train. So the logistic chains that exist today, they are quite efficient, both on the Pacific as well on the Atlantic side. The gains that you can get by using the Arctic route are very, very small for the time being. The reason why commercially all the other big ship companies other than COSCO decided not to look into it. But the problem is not today. The problem is what's going to happen in 20 years from now. And I'm very afraid that nothing is done, that by then it will be irreversible. I think the trend will start going that way, and then it'll be very difficult to stop. I remember a phrase from I think it was President Eisenhower that said, if you want to resolve a small problem, turn it into a big problem. So you just have to make this a big problem. You have to start creating the notion that we're talking about is a huge problem, a huge threat. Okay. Now, ironically, I think that's what's happening with this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is that in a way we're being forced to understand that the global catastrophes require global solutions. And I am somewhat optimistic that what we're talking about here, which is really a global problem, needs a concert of nations that decided that this has to be also a global solution. And for that, of course, you need the leadership. Sorry, I thought I turned it off. You need global leadership, which we've been missing for the last few years. But I'm optimistic that somehow a wave of concern and understanding of what's at play will end up changing the way things are working right now.
Thank you, Jorge. Karen, I will take a question from the audience again, and I would address it to you. It regards the specific aspect of the summer sea ice in the Arctic. It could disappear completely by 2035. That's not a long way from today. Do you think, should we be speeding up action to reduce emissions more rapidly in order to try and protect this remaining summer sea ice? Can it even be done?
Well, that's the big question. Can it even be done? But yes, we need to speed up action in every way that we can. And that means each of us working individually. It means our countries working to up the ante, to make their commitments stronger, to raise their commitments, particularly in this year, in the lead up to COP26 in the UK, well, yeah, in the UK and later this year, to make sure that those commitments are aligned with the 1.5 degree warming maximum that we have been set. We are already seeing so many changes. Some of the things that are happening in the ocean will continue to happen despite what we do, because that time lag is built in there already. Some of the melting of the ice, whether it's in the Arctic or the Antarctic, in the Himalayas, talking about the cryosphere, you know, we've just seen in the past week or so a huge avalanche and destruction as a result of melting part of our cryosphere, and the impacts that has on people. So we really don't have time anymore to think about what could be done, what might be done. We need strong multilateralism, revitalized multilateralism, countries working together to make pledges, to take action. We need the business community to step up to make sure that business investments, the asset managers and owners are not investing in assets that could drive higher warming or heating, whether it's in the air or at sea. We need to make sure that decisions that are being made to manage the global commons that are our oceans are being made in a way that guard against rising beyond that 1.5 degree threshold. And we need each of us in our actions to do that as well. And, you know, Kristina was mentioning Russia and the Arctic. We need shippers, vessel owners, ship owners, and the folks that are investing, financing, insuring them, to make sure that it is not okay to use some of those ports, because it isn't. It is no longer okay. We need to take precautionary action. And I guess that is the real, I may be sounding, in years past, I would have been called hysterical for sounding the alarm, but I think, you know, I'm sitting in Washington, DC at the moment, and there is an ice storm here as a result of the Arctic polar change in weather that we've seen over the last few weeks. This weirdness, this weather weirdness that we referred to right at the beginning of this call is something that is happening around the world now. And if it doesn't wake us up to what needs to happen now, then we have a real problem. So we've got to wake up, we've got to take action, and all of us need to be involved every step of the way.
So Karen, I would like to pose this question to you and then to Kristina afterwards. We're talking about the Arctic and the Antarctic. For most people around the world, these are pretty remote areas. Most people in the world will never even go close to them. So how do you raise awareness and make people understand that what happens there also happens to them?
Well, so I understand that in Portugal, for instance, there is a lot of fish consumption. People love fish in Portugal. Without the circumpolar current around Antarctica that is driving what we call primary productivity, the very small animals and plants that go up through the main coastal currents that come up the coast of Africa or Latin America, those currents feed the fish that feed the world. Without a stable Antarctic, some of the fish that folks love to eat in Portugal will not be on the table. They will not be in the sea. There will not be fish there for them to eat. The same happens in terms of the weather and the changes that we're seeing in terms of the weather. And again, referring back to the coronavirus pandemic, we are seeing the impacts of human on nature. We are seeing these inadvertent impacts. We don't know what might happen. So we may never go to the Antarctic or the Arctic, but we need to know that the air conditioner that powers our planet is in the Arctic. The food that feeds us is driven up from the Antarctic. We need to take care of both of them because together they help make our planet whole. And we need to know that they are part of our lives every single day.
Kristina, if you could send out a worldwide wake-up call for this issue, what would you say?
I think it's hard to do better than echo the Secretary General of the United Nations now, Antonio Guterres, who's saying we have to stop waging war on the planet. The planet is going to start waging war on us, slapping us in the face in unpredictable ways. We cannot control the weather. We cannot control climate. We need to be part of the challenge. We need to all come together and recognize that this is a shared threat to the stability of our planet, the stability of our civilizations. And I'm reading this wonderful book right now called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And there, the Paris Agreement, or I would say the UN, actually develops a ministry that is charged with speaking on behalf of future generations, both animal and human, and trying to inject that concern for the long-term impacts of what we're doing. This should be part of every decision we make. What will be the impacts just even 20 years from now? What will be the impact 30 years from now? 22nd century seems like a long way, but our grandchildren are going to be around in the 22nd century. We need to be planning for the future, and we need to be empowered to plan for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristina. Now, sadly, we are coming close to the end of our panel. I would like to give the floor again to each and every one of you, and thank you for being here. I would give you some 2 to 3 minutes for some closing arguments. I will start with you, Rear Admiral Ventura Soares.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. Well, I think globally speaking, we have to act in the people's minds and raise awareness about these issues. Now, some real changes and some questions, for instance, they should be raised to the youngers. For instance, do you want to get rid of your iPhones in order to eliminate extraction of rare earth minerals used in some parts of the cell phone, especially in protected areas like the Arctic? Could be a question, and is a very transversal question to the youngers in any continent. Another one, do you want to restrain your touristic flights in order to decrease significantly the carbon dioxide emissions and reduce ice melting in the Arctic and Antarctic? And another question, I think this kind of questions that should be placed in the different societies in order to have a global answer. Otherwise, even if there is some people that could they could be or not in government in some situation, but if there is only an elite to work on that, is not enough to have big changes in all the planet. So we need to reach all the citizens and all the arts and all the people in order to have great changes. That's the message that I'd like to say here. Thank you.
Rear Admiral, we still have a little time. I would just like to take another question that came from our audience. Are you concerned about the militarization of the Arctic?
Well, I don't think so for the next years. I think the coastal states, the first intention is to occupy the areas of interest by knowledge. Otherwise, it puts some destroyers or submarines there to protect something that nobody's know really what's going on. That is not a good strategy. I think all the coastal states and even some other states, the idea on the first stage is to have a better knowledge, scientific knowledge, and know what's going on there about resources. And probably in the second decade of this century, maybe we can have some kind of military scenario, but I don't think this is not a problem for the next 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopeful words there. Jorge, I would go back to you now. I would like to ask you for any loose ends that you'd like to address.
Okay, thank you very much. It has been very interesting and pleasant. First of all, I'm in 100% agreement with Admiral Ventura Soares in that the most important thing is to make the younger people aware of what's going on, because they are the ones who can create a wave of influence. They are really the influencers at the lowest level, but they are big influence. If they start worrying about what's going on, of course, it's difficult to make them believe that this is a serious problem. So it's going to take a lot of convincing. But to leave it on a positive note, I am a big believer in technology change by leaps and bounds. Very strong changes in technology. And I'm saying this in particular in this framework because I was reading about this quantum computer that Google has developed, which, to give you an idea, I mean, it resolves some sort of a factoring problem in a few seconds that a regular computer would take, is at 10 years, I think it is. Maybe that's exaggerated. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the supercomputers, the reason there are supercomputers in the world is actually to predict the weather. It's extremely difficult. It's one of the great technical challenges, actually, is to have models that can predict the weather. And I'm somewhat hopeful that if we come to these quantum computers, that in fact we can have reliable predictions that will scare the pants off people, because that's the only way. So that's my hope for the future.
Thank you, Jorge. Going back to you, Kristina, we are about to close our panel. What parting thoughts would you like to leave with our audience?
Well, I think we need to raise our eyes to the sky. We've made it to Mars, but we still have so much of our own ocean unexplored. So we need to raise our eyes to the sky as well as to the deepest depths. We need global cooperation and global institutions that are fit for purpose. In a changing ocean, we need the best available quantum computers, but we also need humans who are deciding in favor of people and the planet. That this is still very much within our control. As new technologies are developed, we need to understand their range of potential impacts. And before we unleash them, we need to understand whether they are going to actually do more harm than good. And I'm talking about some of the ideas for geoengineering. So I've been working on this new emerging treaty for marine areas beyond national jurisdiction to better conserve and sustainably use marine life beyond national boundaries. There's no time really to hesitate to wait for this to be finalized and to come into force. We need global communities working to implement this treaty to better protect the marine environment through networks of marine protected areas, through environmental impact assessments that actually require the application of best available and new scientific information so we can make informed decisions about the impacts and to stop, not go forward with a new technology if it can't be shown not to cause significant adverse impacts. And this applies to things like plastics. Can we get over our single-use economy, but also to our mineral use? Can we get over our single-use economy where we have throwaway cell phones, throwaway computers? How do we factor in the need to better utilize these materials? It's really, you know, we have a finite planet and we need to learn how to come together to better manage it together. So the High Seas Treaty, as Karen has said, would be really a top priority, but we also need better strategic use of minerals, metals, all resources on the planet. We need support for new science, for new innovation and technology, and to make sure that it is done in a way that is inclusive, sustainable, and really serves to support multilateral and regional cooperation and collaboration for the good of the planet. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kristina. Back to you, Karen. You have the next to last words. I hope that the ice around you melts soon so you can enjoy the Washington landscape better in the next few days. Go ahead.
Thank you, Antonio. So do I. It would be lovely to go out and walk without fear of slipping. You know, I think from this conversation, and thank you so much to the Club of Lisbon for hosting us today. What's absolutely clear is, you know, in addition to the need for youth to get involved and citizens around the world to get involved and use their voices, we really, you know, there are three key issues here. We need the ocean and what is going on in the ocean to be elevated, to be recognized as a high political issue, because it is linked so closely to what is happening with the climate and with the biodiversity crises. We need diplomatic outreach at the highest levels to solve some of these issues, to begin to address them with political will, again, at the highest level. Heads of state, finance ministers, we need them engaged in these issues, and we need there to be high ambition to drive action forward. As I said at the beginning, at the height of the Cold War, Russia and the United States came together to declare Antarctica a place of peace and science, a World Heritage place for all of us. And now we're 60 years on. We need to learn from that lesson. We need to take it and expand it to other places in our planet that are so important to all of us. We have done it before. We need to do it again, and we need to do it quickly. So I am really hopeful that over the next 12 months, that will be possible. And we can only do that if we get everyone involved, everyone engaged, raising the alarm, raising our voices, but also raising our common concern about the future and making sure that together we create the future we want, rather than focusing on having to deal with all the problems we've generated. Let's focus forward on that future rather than building backwards into a past that is unsustainable and that we know that we can't continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. So I would like to thank you all again and thank the Lisbon Club for bringing us all together. I would like to thank you for your time and your commitment to this debate. I would also like to invite everyone to keep following this conference. And right next, we'll have an intervention by Ambassador Francisco Duarte Lopes. He's the permanent Portuguese representative with the United Nations. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you.